Welcome back to Nature Labs and our live coverage of the Ontario provincial election. And even though the polls only closed a few minutes ago, we already have a result. Don't let anyone tell you that pollsters are always wrong, because as it turns out, the pollsters were pretty much dead on. Doug Ford and his Ontario Progressive Conservative Party have been re-elected with a majority government for the province of Ontario. Now, not a big shock, as we talked about earlier. The polls were suggesting this was probably going to be a runaway victory for Doug Ford. It looks like he's going to do it roughly about 44% of the vote. We'll see how that shakes out by the end of the night, but that's a pretty solid majority government territory. Whether you're talking a provincial election or a federal election, yeah, even if you don't get 50%, you definitely get way more than 50% of the votes in our first past the post electoral system, as you already know. The real question of this race, of course, we talked about earlier, is who will form the opposition party. And as we also talked about earlier, the NDP's vote looks very, very efficient. Now, it's only early days here in terms of the polls being closed. Not that early that we don't know who's going to win the thing, but we don't quite know yet who will form the opposition. But certainly right now, it does look like the NDP will go back to being the official opposition in Ontario, as they were before Doug Ford called this snap election. Now, they're going to do that, right now at least, with about 18% of the vote. That's compared to the Ontario Liberals, who have almost 30% of the vote. That means they were closer to Doug Ford's totals than they were to the NDP totals, yet they're poised to come in third place in the Ontario legislature. The first past the post system, it's got its quirks, but not that many quirks that the Green Party won't come back with some seats as well. Now, right now it's showing 3. I think this is probably going to settle out at the 2 seats they had coming into this election, but who knows? Time will tell. But a good result so far for the Ontario Green Party, certainly looking like they're going to be able to maintain their beachhead, which means while they might not be a major force in the Ontario legislature, they will certainly have a voice, and their issues will certainly have a place in the debates in that province. One last thing to note, of course, is that there's an independent winning. And if you've watched any of our Nature Labs lessons in social studies, you know that independents don't often have a chance of victory in elections, provincial, federal, or otherwise in this country. If I'm going to bet, I'm going to say that person's probably not going to hold on to that seat. But again, stranger things have happened, and who knows? Hope springs eternal for the former NDP MLA who is running as an independent in this election. But the take-home message here, Doug Ford has won another majority government, his 3rd straight majority. That's a pretty amazing feat, whether we're talking federal or provincial politics, Ontario or otherwise across the country. That's a big deal, because the reality is it's even rarer to win 4 straight victories, majority or otherwise, in our political system. That also means this is probably Doug Ford's last election. He's won, he's got a solid mandate, he'll certainly see this through for the time being, especially with the trade war being the major reason why he supposedly called this election, to secure that mandate to fight Trump. But I don't think that he'll be standing for re-election in 4 years' time, or less, because, as we know, elections don't necessarily come every 4 years. They could come every couple of years in Doug Ford's world. So anything's possible. And it's not to say that he couldn't run a 4th time. Maybe he wants to go down in the history books, but it's a very, very small list in the history books of people who've won 4 elections. And certainly 4 in a row is a massive hill to climb for any incumbent. So probably Doug Ford's last hurrah, and certainly a great hurrah it is for him. Who knows what the future will hold for Merritt Stiles and the NDP. Certainly, if she's been able to secure official opposition status, her job probably seems safe. Ontario Liberal Party, she significantly grew her vote share, the party's vote share. She certainly has increased those vote totals and the seat totals too, but not to the degree that she was hoping, and the Liberals were undoubtedly hoping in Ontario. Is her job safe? I suspect the ball is probably in her court, so we'll have to wait and see on that. Certainly the Greens seem to be fairly secure behind their leader. So that's sort of the shape in terms of leadership positions going forward in the Ontario legislature. Now, the big question that we haven't discussed and is worth bringing up now is, what does this all mean in the national context? Because maybe somebody in British Columbia is watching this and saying, why should I care what's happening in Ontario? Well, you should care. 2 reasons. Ontario is, of course, Canada's biggest, most populous province. It delivers the most seats to the House of Commons. And an interesting quirk of Ontario politics is they very rarely elect the same party provincially as they do federally. And given that we're about to enter a federal election campaign, in all likelihood. That provides some interesting perspective for Pierre Poilievre and his federal Conservative Party, because if historical trends hold true, it means Ontario will likely break for the federal Liberals if they've just voted a Conservative premier into Queen's Park in Toronto. So will that hold true, or will Pierre Poilievre be able to buck that trend and have a Conservative supermajority between both the Ontario legislature and Parliament Hill? It remains to be seen. We'll see. But there has been some speculation that one of the ulterior motives that Doug Ford had in calling this election now, before the federal election, was he didn't want to tempt fate and run the risk of being on the wrong side of that historical trend, if you will. So Doug Ford back in Queen's Park, Pierre Poilievre, maybe watch out on the federal scene. It's a little hard to believe that trend is so ironclad, but historical trends are historical trends for a reason, and this is a real thing in Ontario. They really do always seem to vote for two parties, depending on who's in power in which place. So that's one national context. And certainly, as we're watching the federal Liberal leadership race unfold, likely Mark Carney's going to win that. And certainly the polls would suggest the federal Liberals went basically from having no chance at forming government to a real chance at forming government. So it's worth keeping in mind what's happened tonight, the historical trends in Ontario, and what that might mean for a federal election that certainly appears to be becoming more competitive than one would have assumed even a month ago. So that's one national context in terms of why the Ontario election tonight matters to you no matter where in this country you live. The second reason, of course, is the strong mandate that Doug Ford wanted and got from the Ontario voters. Now, we can debate whether mandates are a real thing, but certainly it's hard to argue that Doug Ford doesn't have the backing of the people of Ontario. What does that mean? Well, it means he's got a strong mandate to stand up for Ontario workers, as we discussed earlier, who will be disproportionately affected by Trump's tariffs if they come into effect as early as next week. The interesting part of this is where this might clash with other strong mandates in our country. Scott Moe, we covered this during the Saskatchewan election. He had a strong mandate from the people of Saskatchewan. Danielle Smith is not that far removed from getting a strong mandate from Alberta voters. Yes, the race was slightly closer, but certainly she has an increasing stranglehold on her governing UCP party, United Conservative Party. That means both Smith and Moe have strong mandates of their own, equal to what Doug Ford has managed to achieve in Ontario. Those mandates, though, are not necessarily aligned. Of course, in Alberta and Saskatchewan, they want to protect oil and gas, the industry and the workers, and try to have carve-outs from Trump's tariffs. They've almost been sort of arguing against sort of this Team Canada approach, which has been heavily championed by Doug Ford, who wants to, of course, protect Ontario workers. And he wants to use every tool in the toolbox to fight back against Trump, because Trump, more than anything else, is targeting aluminum and steel and autos, and those are Ontario's big industries. So if he wants to fight back, he's going to want to use oil and gas. Of course, Scott Moe and Danielle Smith will not want to use that. It's the clash of conservative, strong mandates. Who will win out? If with Doug Ford being reelected, it will have major implications in terms of this conversation, the so-called Team Canada conversation on a national level, in terms of how Canada and the provinces work together, or don't, to fight Trump's proposed tariffs. And that, of course, will go a long way towards deciding whether we are actually unified as a country in the face of these threats, the tariff threats, as well as the sovereignty threats. And that goes a long way to deciding whether we will remain a united nation that is sovereign and, of course, isn't battling internal national unity problems. And as you all know from your social studies class or your history class, Canada has had national unity problems throughout our history, specifically, of course, with Quebec, but increasingly, as your teacher, Donna Kennedy Glines, has told you, with Saskatchewan and Alberta, and even to a degree, British Columbia. So in all of this case, this election will have a huge say in terms of our national unity, our sovereignty, our approach to Trump, our approach to growing and trying to stabilize and protect our economy. And of course, all of that impacts what we do at the intersection of people and nature, as you know. So Ontario elections, just like elections in BC and New Brunswick and Saskatchewan and Nova Scotia, and soon to be PEI in Newfoundland and Labrador, they all impact the Federation no matter where you live. It's always worth paying attention to. And of course, it's just a real life example of what you're learning in class, and it's always fun to learn it in a real world context rather than just from some silly person in a video.